first house is going to say stuff about your health. And that's because Saturn has to do with illness, and the first house has to do with your body. Saturn in the first house is also going to say stuff about your wealth, because Saturn has to do with reduction. The first house has to do with manifestation. And finally, Saturn in the first house is going to speak about your personal influence, like your personal power. And that's because Saturn is very oriented towards the masses, and the first house is very oriented to the self. So, okay, Saturn in the first house speaks about your health, your wealth, and your personal influence. Well, what does it say about those three things? Well, regarding health, Saturn in the first house might be saying you have a very strong immune system. Or it might be saying that you have a very weak immune system. Regarding wealth, Saturn in the first house could be saying that you really know how to preserve your wealth and therefore grow it. But Saturn in the first house might also be saying you have no idea how to hold on to things and amass money. And regarding personal influence, Saturn in the first could be saying that you have an immense amount of influence over the masses. Or it might mean you are immensely subordinate to people who are in power. Whether or not Saturn is saying the positive things or the negative things about your health, wealth, and personal influence depends entirely and exactly upon how positive or negative Saturn itself is in your first house. So I will explain how to figure that out at the end of this video. And also, if you're not the mathematical type, I figure it out for you in the reports that I offer. So if you want, you can go to my website, victicara.com, and order one of my reports, and it will tell you exactly how positive or negative, and therefore how much stress to put on either the positive or the negative traits of Saturn in the first house. So before we get there and explain how you figure out Saturn's positivity, let's just sit down for a second and be sure that we're on the same page about what it symbolizes. What does Saturn really symbolize when it's in the first house? We said it symbolizes strong immunity. The implication is that you have a great deal of resistance to getting ill. And the connotation here is that this stable, strong health endures into old age. You're physically, what we would say, hardy. You can endure quite a bit of stress or fatigue before you actually feel stressed out or fatigued. But to the extent that Saturn is negative in your first house, you won't be seeing that side of the picture as much as you'll be seeing like the weakness coming out. You easily succumb to bacteria, germs, viruses, etc. A little bit of exertion makes you feel tired right away. A little bit of stress makes you need to take a break. So you have weak resistances. You therefore often feel sick. And therefore you are at a handicap compared to most people, because you're carrying around this burden of being easily tired and therefore often slow and often weak. So the sense of handicap is also implied by Saturn in the first house in negative dignity. And that handicap can affect different things depending on the sign and depending on the rest of the situation in the chart. Now let's move on and make sure that we understand what we're talking about with the wealth symbolisms of Saturn in the first. We said you can preserve your assets. You are very much in touch with your sources of wealth. You're very practical about wealth. You know where your wealth is. You know where it's coming from. Therefore, you know how to take care of it. You have a lot of control over your resources. You don't have big fantasy dreams about what you want to own and all that stuff. You actually deal with what you practically have, and therefore you control it well and you grow it slowly but surely. So that's what's implied by a positive Saturn in the first. However, to the extent that Saturn's dignity is negative while it's in the first house, you won't see that side of the picture at all. You'll see the other side. So you don't really have a firm control of your resources, which means that things are slipping out of your grasp. Your money is falling out of your pocket. It's going down the drain. It's going out the window. Because you're not really practical. You're not really in touch with it, and you're not really willing to do the basic work that managing wealth involves. So it winds up being a poverty situation where you run out of money. If Saturn in the first house is very, very negative. And of course, if the rest of the chart is also indicating similar things. Now, finally, this third category of symbolism. Saturn in the first house has a big impact on your personal influence. On the positive side, that means you have a lot of power and respect. The first house is the house of self. Saturn is the planet of masses of people. So Saturn in the first house in a positive condition indicates that the self has a lot of influence on the masses. And you have people that are leaders, not really because they're super authoritarian or super power hungry, but really because they're very appealing to the common person. And they really understand the common person. They really understand what people really need. They really understand what people really want. Therefore, they appeal to a large section of people. However, the opposite interpretation should be highlighted to the extent that Saturn is in negative dignity when it's in the first house. And what's the opposite interpretation? Well, it's not that the first house is controlling Saturn, but it's that Saturn is ruining the first house. It means that you are becoming one of the masses. You are becoming one of the controlled, one of the manipulated, one of the exploited. So you don't have very high ambitions. Your ambitions are towards things that are very common and ordinary. You're not really inspired to go search for a career and climb a career path. You're okay just getting whatever jobs are available. So now let's bring back the topic of the positivity or negativity of Saturn. Do we have the positive traits or do we have the negative traits? Actually speaking, you'll have a balance somewhere between the positive and the negative traits. So you may ask, how can I have a balance between poverty and wealth? Well, it will depend on what else in the chart is specifically weak or particularly strong. So if you have like a half and a half East Saturn in the first house and also a weak 11th and second, then it's going to be more towards the loss of wealth versus if you have the same half and half East Saturn in the first house, but a strong 11th and second house, then that's not going to be where the weakness part of Saturn plays out. The strength of Saturn is going to play out towards wealth. So as you see, the interpretation of any planet in any house really depends an awful lot on the positivity or negativity of that planet. So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the first house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the first house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall, and Saturn in Libra is exalted, and there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic or the sun or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10, and the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If a planet is lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the first, because the lord of the first wants to protect the whole chart because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the fifth or the ninth. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the fourth or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry. You can do that. You can go to my website, victicara.com, click into the report section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart, or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. Saturn in the second house is going to say everything about your wealth, your independence, and your acceptance. So Saturn in the second indicates great thriftiness, or maybe it just means you're very, very stingy. Saturn in the second house represents excellent self-sufficiency, or maybe it means you've just been abandoned. Saturn in the second house indicates profound universality, or maybe you're just wandering around. How do you know the difference? Which one is it? Is it the positive stuff or is it the negative stuff? That depends entirely upon the positivity of Saturn in your chart. The more positive it is, the more it symbolizes the positive aspects. And the more negative it is, the more the negative aspects. So I will explain how to figure that out at the end of this video. And also, if you're not the mathematical type, I figure it out for you in the reports that I offer. So if you want, you can go to my website, victicara.com, and order one of my reports, and it will tell you exactly how positive or negative, and therefore how much stress to put on either the positive or the negative traits. So Saturn in the second house indicates great thriftiness. Yeah, you spend money wisely. You buy things that are actually useful. You take your time to make sure you're actually getting the value that you should be getting. But on the other hand, this same trait could just be described as stinginess. And it would feel more like stinginess the more Saturn is negative in the chart. So what's the difference between stinginess and thriftiness? Well, thriftiness is wise spending. Stinginess is reluctance to spend. Stinginess really comes into you should have given money at this point. You should have paid. You should have spent. But because you're so attached to not spending money, you missed this opportunity, or you kind of violated something that you should have done. So a positive Saturn in the second house indicates great wisdom in how you spend money. A negative Saturn in the second house indicates great foolishness in how you spend money in terms of not spending it correctly, failing to spend it. Another thing about Saturn in the second house is that it describes a person who's very, very self-sufficient. They're independent. They know how to take care of themselves and nourish themselves. But the negative permutation of this is kind of you are forced to be self-sufficient because nobody's taking care of you. So negative Saturn in the second house indicates lacking the support that typically comes from family and really close friends, and instead being ostracized or alienated from those support groups. A positive Saturn in the second house describes somebody with great universality. They have a universal relatability to them. They're able to relate with and interact with and work well with and get along well with many, many different types of people in many, many different kinds of situations. But the downside of this, again, is just Saturn in the second house means you're forced into this universality because you weren't really given a home. You don't really have a home base. That's why you're open to all kinds of exotic foreign ideas and so forth. So a negative Saturn in the second house indicates a person who is wandering. They don't really have roots that nourish them. So therefore they sort of wander around. If it's positive Saturn in the second house, then that's fine because they're diverse and they have a universal relatability and they get their nourishment without needing a centralized root. But if it's negative Saturn in the second house, that's not okay. Not having a central root in their life gives them a lack of nourishment and causes them to just feel kind of aimless and homeless and like a wanderer or a vagabond. Now again, how do you know which of these extremes applies to you? It's dependent on you figuring out whether or not your Saturn is positive or negative. The more positive Saturn is, the more it's indicating and speaking about the positive traits of Saturn in the second. And the more negative it is, the more it's speaking about the negative traits. So as you see, the interpretation of any planet in any house really depends an awful lot on the positivity or negativity of that planet. So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the first house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the first house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall and Saturn in Libra is exalted. And there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic or the sun or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10. And the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If the planet is the lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the first, because the lord of the first wants to protect the whole chart because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the 5th or the 9th. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the 4th or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing, or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry. You can do that. You can go to my website, victicara.com, click into the reports section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart, or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. Saturn in the 3rd house has everything to do with your willpower, your steadiness, and your affection. So Saturn in the 3rd house means incredibly strong determination. Or maybe that means you're just easily bored and disinterested. Saturn in the 3rd house indicates great reliability. Or maybe that just means you're really predictable. Saturn in the 3rd house indicates a deeply unselfish person. Or maybe that just means you don't really like yourself. So how do you know whether Saturn in the 3rd represents the positive versions or the negative versions of these 3 things? That depends entirely on how positive or negative Saturn is in your chart. So I will explain how to figure that out at the end of this video. And also, if you're not the mathematical type, I figure it out for you in the reports that I offer. So if you want, you can go to my website, victicara.com, and order one of my reports, and it will tell you exactly how positive or negative, and therefore how much stress to put on either the positive or the negative traits. So because Saturn in the third house is all about willpower, if it's positive, it indicates a person with incredible determination. The willpower is very strong. They focus on something and they stay focused on it. They keep their determination fixed on their tasks and their objectives and their goals. So they can accomplish really significant goals. And in that sense, they have a great deal of intelligence. The strong willpower implies also strong intelligence in the sense of knowing how to get things done, knowing how to accomplish your goals. The negative ramification of this, however, which shows up the more negative Saturn is in your chart, is that you're just unmotivated and bored. You're disinterested in things. You put your attention on one thing and nothing else interests you. So most of the time, you're just really bored because you don't get that much opportunity to engage in the thing that you really wanted to engage in. We're interpreting that way because Saturn's negative in this chart. A positive Saturn in the third house describes a person who is extremely reliable. You can depend on them. They hold through on their promises. So they're very trustworthy and honorable. But the same trait in a negative sense means, well, you're just predictable. You might be described even as typical. You're not surprising. You're therefore not that interesting. So the more that Saturn is negative in this chart, the more that it's not really as reliable as it is just predictable. In other words, this trait of reliability, instead of having a positive impact on your life, it has the opposite impact. It has a negative impact. Saturn in the third house has a huge effect on affection, and that might come as a surprise to you because neither Saturn nor the third house really is about affection. But guess what? The third house is about selfishness, and Saturn is about limitation and restriction. So Saturn in the third house really restricts and controls and takes the emotion out of selfishness. So the end result of Saturn in the third house is unselfishness or affectionate nature. So with a positive Saturn in the third house, the person is actually quite cooperative. They're not selfish. They're affectionate. They care about other people. But the negative side of not being selfish is not taking care of yourself, not even liking yourself. And so if Saturn is in the third house with negative positivity, then that is more what's actually happening here. Instead of unselfishness, it's really unself-caring, self-loathing, self-criticism. Again, how do you know how much of the negative traits or how much of the positive traits you should expect for yourself or for a chart that you're trying to read? It all depends on assessing the positivity or negativity of Saturn. Everybody will have some kind of mixture of the positive and negative traits that come out more or less in different situations. But to know the ratio of that mixture, you need to know the ratio of positivity to negativity in Saturn itself. So as you see, the interpretation of any planet in any house really depends an awful lot on the positivity or negativity of that planet. So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the first house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the first house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall and Saturn in Libra is exalted. And there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic or the sun or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10, and the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If a planet is lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the first, because the lord of the first wants to protect the whole chart because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the 5th to the 9th. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the 4th or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing, or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry. You can do that. You can go to my website, victicara.com, click into the reports section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart, or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. Also, interpreting Saturn in the 4th house revolves around 3 key themes: happiness, satisfaction, and simplicity. If Saturn is positive in the 4th house, it indicates happiness in the sense of being very resistant to causes of sadness. Conversely, if Saturn is negative in the 4th house, it indicates the converse. You're difficult to encourage, you're difficult to console, you're difficult to cheer up. If Saturn is positive in the 4th house, then it signifies having minimal needs. You can be content without needing that many props. But if the converse is true and Saturn is negative in the 4th house, then the converse is the interpretation. So you do need a lot of props before you feel satisfied, which makes it easy to displease you or difficult to please you. Finally, if Saturn is positive in the 4th house, it indicates a person who's very simple. And again, if the converse is the case and Saturn is negative in the 4th house, then the interpretation is converse. You're not simple at all, really. You have a lot of needs, and those needs are not easy to meet. So like I said, when you interpret Saturn in the 4th house, you deal with these 3 themes: happiness, satisfaction, and simplicity. And then depending on how positive Saturn is in the 4th house, that's how much you skew your interpretation towards the positive versions. Conversely, the more negative Saturn is in the 4th house, that's how much you stress the negative possibilities of the interpretation. So I will explain how to figure that out at the end of this video. And also, if you're not the mathematical type, I figure it out for you in the reports that I offer. So if you want, you can go to my website, victicara.com, and order one of my reports, and it will tell you exactly how positive or negative, and therefore how much stress to put on either the positive or the negative traits. Let's look at these traits of positive and negative Saturn in the 4th house in a little more detail. On the theme of happiness, if Saturn's positive in the 4th house, you're happy usually. The reason is that it's difficult for you to get sad. Maybe you're old, but that doesn't make you sad. Maybe you're not that rich, but that doesn't make you sad. It doesn't take a lot of damage from the negative events. It's resistant against the negative events. For example, the traditional chart for Sri Ram has Saturn in the 4th house exalted in Libra. Think of all the difficult events that happen in the life of Rama. But is Rama ever getting grumpy or stressed out or sad? Hardly. Now let's look at the converse of this. If Saturn is negative, or the more that Saturn is negative, because it's not really a question of if a planet is positive or negative, it's the spectrum between those 2 polarities. So depending on how negative Saturn is, the less you have resilience to sadness, and the more you have resistance to happiness. See the polarity? So basically that means it's difficult to cheer you up. When you get sad, you stay sad. And it's, maybe somebody does something nice for you, but it doesn't make a difference. You still feel sad. Maybe you won the game, but it doesn't make a difference. You still feel sad. Maybe you're really pretty, but it doesn't make a difference. You still feel sad. Maybe you're really rich, but it doesn't make a difference. You still feel sad. So an example of this is Marilyn Monroe. Saturn is in the fourth house, Scorpio with Mars, far enough away to make it pretty negative. Now let's turn to the slightly different angle on this whole interpretation, which is not necessarily happiness per se, but satisfaction. The more Saturn is positive in the fourth house, the less stuff you need. Like this kid here, he doesn't have that much stuff, but he still feels fine. A positive Saturn in the fourth house doesn't give a very materialistic outlook on life. It doesn't give that much interest in pursuing things and trying to, acquire things, because it feels like it's got enough. It's fine. I already have enough. I'm happy. A great example of this is Sri Chaitanya. This chart has Saturn in the fourth house and Sagittarius with Jupiter nearby. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is a famous sannyasi, a famous renunciate. Somebody that really is not materialistic at all, because they already feel like they have more than enough stuff. So the more positive Saturn is in the fourth house, the more simple your needs. And the more negative Saturn is in the fourth house, the more demanding your needs are. You're not satisfied unless things are really quite exactly the way you want them to be, and you want a lot. So a way of expressing this is it's easy to disappoint you, or you're easily saddened. You're not easily satisfied. You're easily dissatisfied. A great example of this is Ernest Hemingway. Saturn in the fourth house in Sagittarius, but with Rahu. Now, the third theme to interpret with Saturn in the fourth house is simplicity. The more positive Saturn is here in the fourth, the more simple you are. Positive Saturn in the fourth house really will like things that are simple, clean, basic, minimalistic. For example, Hermann Hesse, Saturn in the fourth house, Pisces, with Jupiter in the first in its own sign. Hermann Hesse, of course, was very, very into this Buddhist and Eastern minimalistic philosophies. Conversely, the more negative Saturn is in the fourth house, the more you're not simple. You don't like things that are just basic. You like things that are fancy, and you kind of need things that are fancy. You expect or need or require kind of a demanding or high level of comfort and amenity. And of course, it's not easy to get those. See, the advantageous part of having a positive Saturn in the fourth is that the stuff that you like is the stuff that's easy to get. The disadvantageous stuff of having a negative Saturn in the fourth is the stuff that you like is not easy to get. So you often fail to get it. So you often feel dissatisfied because of that. The one example of negative Saturn in the fourth house is, we could use Marilyn Monroe as a great example of this. She has all kinds of riches, all kinds of fame, all kinds of fancy stuff if she wants, but it's never really consoling her. It's never really satisfying her. She's never feeling like it's quite enough. Another example would be Gwyneth Paltrow. And in Paltrow's case, it's not exactly like a very negative Saturn in the fourth house. It's just a mildly negative Saturn in the fourth house, being the 12th lord and having a subpar dignity. So with Gwyneth Paltrow, you find somebody that really has this huge need for wealth and, ridiculously lavish things. But because it's not really that negative, and because she's got other things supporting her in the rest of the chart, it sort of works as like a materialistic motivator for her. So Saturn in the fourth can work out to be a materialistic motivator also. But that's only when it's a bit negative and the rest of the chart is quite strong. Generally, what you get from Saturn in the fourth house is a non-materialistic motivator. So as you see, the interpretation of any planet in any house really depends an awful lot on the positivity or negativity of that planet. So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the first house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the first house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall, and Saturn in Libra is exalted. And there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic or the sun or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10. And the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If a planet is the lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the first, because the lord of the first wants to protect the whole chart because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the 5th or the 9th. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the 4th or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing, or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry. You can do that. You can go to my website, victicara.com, click into the reports section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart, or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. The 5th house symbolizes intellect, and Saturn symbolizes objectivity. So if Saturn is in the 5th house, it symbolizes objective use of intellect. So the best word to really encapsulate the full flavor of it is probably logic. The next theme, again, has to deal with the 5th house representing intellect, and now Saturn represents tenacity. So Saturn in the 5th is tenacious intellect. So we could maybe summarize that with the word focus or concentration. Finally, the 5th house represents affection, how you express your emotions. And Saturn represents objectivity again. It's going to impact how you love. Now, each one of these key phrases, logic, focus, and love, might have a positive or a negative spin to it, depending on how Saturn is doing in the 5th house. So with logic, for example, Saturn in the 5th house might mean you're a very rational person, or it might mean you're too rational. You're like skeptical and negative in your thinking. With focus, Saturn in the 5th house could mean you have great concentration. You're very focused. Or it could mean that you're overly focused and like unrelenting. With love, Saturn in the 5th house in a positive state, it's like objective love, not subjective love. So it's like impartial love. Or if it's negative in the 5th house, it can mean indiscriminate love. The way to figure out whether you're getting the positive characteristics of Saturn in the 5th or the negative characteristics is to know whether Saturn itself is positive or negative in that house. So I will explain how to figure that out at the end of this video. And also, if you're not the mathematical type, I figure it out for you in the reports that I offer. So if you want, you can go to my website, victicara.com, and order one of my reports, and it will tell you exactly how positive or negative, and therefore how much stress to put on either the positive or the negative traits. So we have 3 themes with 2 polarities each. Let's discuss each polarity of each theme in more detail now. First thing we said is that since the 5th house is about intellect and Saturn is about objectivity, Saturn in the 5th has a very objective or impartial intellect, which means that it's very rational. The intellect of Saturn in the 5th house has emotions well under control. It doesn't let emotions influence the intellectual processes, or how it figures things out, or how it evaluates things, or how it plans things. It's very objective in its planning and in its assessment and in its evaluation. So you can call it very rational, and you can also call it very practical. It doesn't care so much for what it likes or dislikes. It cares more about what works or doesn't work. So Saturn in the fifth house is very good for scientific thinking, logical thinking. For example, the Nobel Prize physicist Felix Bloch has Saturn in the fifth house in its own sign. So it's a very positive Saturn in the fifth house, and he's extremely good with logic and rationality. It's also conjoined Ketu exactly in his case. So his logic and intellect is very good at going into the substructure, the atomic structures of things. Now let's look at the opposite end of the spectrum from this same theme. The fifth house has to do with intellect. Saturn is objective. So you should be very rational and logical, right? But a lot of times you'll find that Saturn in the fifth house people are so much logical as they are just skeptical and harsh and critical. It's that lack of emotion in the intellectual process. It can be very draining and negative feeling. So with Saturn in the fifth house, you can easily get a type of person who just doesn't like anything. So that gives them more of a slant of just finding problems everywhere, being negative, finding flaws with everything, being very difficult to satisfy, always having a critical eye, always looking at things as if they are wrong. An example of somebody with this placement is Charles Bukowski. He has Saturn in the fifth house, Virgo, which in itself is not too bad, but it's with the debilitated Venus. I think the next theme is that the fifth house has to do with intellect, and Saturn has to do with tenacity. It's got a great longevity. So Saturn in the fifth house, therefore, should give you a great amount of focus. It should give you a very long attention span. So these are the kind of people that study really well, learn really well, because they focus for a long time and they don't get distracted. Saturn in the fifth house also helps you be the type of person who does get things done. You don't stop or get distracted midway through. Also, Saturn in the fifth house can be very useful for being the person who doesn't forget things. Now, exactly what kind of things you don't forget has a lot to do with the rest of the chart and how it's affecting Saturn in the fifth house. But the idea of a tenacious or long-lasting intellect, Saturn in the fifth house, implies that it has an effect on memory as well, because you're paying a lot of attention. So therefore, you store the memories more deeply. An example to illustrate this would be Walt Disney, like a perfectionist type of person. And he does indeed have Saturn in the fifth house in its own sign. It's with a bunch of other planets too, so it's a bit complicated, and his chart overall is a bit complicated. But one of the strong parts of it is Saturn in the fifth house in its own sign. The negative permutation of this same dynamic is just to be unrelenting. So you have this tenacious focus. If that's negative, it just means you're like unrelenting. You like don't give a break to anybody. Really unforgiving, really a stickler, harsh and pushing on every little point. And there's an interesting effect on memory. As we just said, Saturn in the fifth house should result in a very strong memory or lasting memory. However, if it's negative in the fifth house, it's not that it gives you a bad memory, but it's the hyper focus of memory, so that you will intensely remember certain things but completely ignore other things. Things that most people remember, you're completely oblivious to, but you're remembering some detail that you happen to focus on. And that's the same way that you're conducting your intelligence in general, is you're hyper-focused on some particular thing that in the big picture probably isn't really that important, but you are so fixated on it and you won't relent from that fixation. Right. An example of a person who illustrates this is Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister. He has Saturn in the fifth house in Sagittarius, which might not seem to be entirely negative at first, but it's at exactly 0 degrees in Sagittarius, and Jupiter also is at exactly 0 degrees, and a bunch of planets in this chart are messed up, and the chart itself is very nodal. It's Ketu-ish and Rahu-ish. The third theme of Saturn in the fifth house is impartial love. A planet in the fifth house is going to affect how you express affection because the fifth house has to do with affection. Saturn is objective. So Saturn in the fifth house indicates impartial affection. The positive slant on that is you are open to love anybody. Your arms are open. You're welcoming to many people. You don't have prejudice really. And you like to extend your affection not just to a particular person, but to society in general or to people in general. An example here is probably Priyanka Chopra. You'll notice she has Saturn in the fifth house, exalted in Libra. And she's a very philanthropic and generally affectionately inclined person. It is with Mars there in the fifth house, so it might not be the ideal example, but she sure is a great example of that impartial affection. The flip side of impartial affection is indiscriminate affection. Positive Saturn in the fifth house, you love everybody. Negative Saturn in the fifth house, you love anybody. Now, positive Saturn in the fifth house is not discriminating in how it loves. And that's a good thing. A negative Saturn in the fifth house is also not discriminating in how it loves, but it's not a good thing. So it's just kind of like very hungry for affection all the time, and therefore getting involved in relationships that really aren't that meaningful. Maybe we can use Janis Joplin as a great example of this. The more positive Saturn is in the fifth house, the more rational, practical, and logical you are, the more focused, attentive, and strong-memoried you are, and the more impartial you are in how you love. However, on the flip side, the more negative Saturn is in the fifth house, the more skeptical and critical you are, the more unrelenting and intense you are, and the more you are indiscriminate in how you love. So as you see, the interpretation of any planet in any house really depends an awful lot on the positivity or negativity of that planet. So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the first house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the first house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall and Saturn in Libra is exalted. And there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic or the sun or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10. And the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If a planet is the lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the first, because the lord of the first wants to protect the whole chart because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the 5th or the 9th. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the 4th or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing, or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry. You can do that. You can go to my website, victorcara.com, click into the report section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. Also, the sixth is the house of illness, and Saturn is the planet of illness. So if Saturn is in your sixth house, it's going to say a lot about your health. The sixth is the house of duties, and Saturn is a planet of work. So if Saturn is in the sixth house, it's going to say a lot about your sense of discipline. The sixth is the house of debt, and Saturn is a planet of poverty. So if Saturn is in the sixth house, it's going to speak volumes about your wealth, or particularly how you handle your debt. Each one of these three themes can have either a positive or a negative spin to it. So there's a positive and negative polarity to each one of these themes. On the positive end of the health theme, Saturn in the sixth house indicates somebody that's very, very healthy. But on the negative end of the same theme, it indicates somebody who is very, very weak. On the theme of discipline, a positive Saturn in the sixth indicates someone with tremendous sense of commitment to duty. But on the negative end of the same thing, it indicates a person who's very self-recriminating. As far as the theme of debt and wealth goes, a positive Saturn in the sixth indicates somebody with great financial discipline. But a negative Saturn in the sixth house symbolizes financial indiscretion. So obviously it's very important to figure out whether or not Saturn is positive or negative before you try to interpret it. The more positive it is, the more you get the positive traits that are possible from Saturn in the sixth. The more negative it is, the more you get the negative traits. So I will explain how to figure that out at the end of this video. And also, if you're not the mathematical type, I figure it out for you in the reports that I offer. So if you want, you can go to my website, victicara.com, and order one of my reports, and it will tell you exactly how positive or negative, and therefore how much stress to put on either the positive or the negative traits. Now let's discuss each one of these possible traits of Saturn, positive and negative, in the sixth house in a bit more detail. First, let's start with the theme of health. Saturn in the sixth has a big impact on health, and if it's a positive Saturn in the sixth, you're very healthy. But in what particular way are you healthy? You should have a very strong digestion. Now, it's not Mars positive in the sixth house, it's Saturn positive in the sixth house, so it's not like a lot of appetite per se. But it's a very long-lived metabolism. Into old age, the metabolism stays strong. The metabolism is very reliable and consistent. Therefore, your appetite is pretty consistent, and you eat food pretty intelligently and well, and you derive the nutrients from it. This also indicates a very strong immunity to disease. You're not having a lot of fluctuations in the energy within inside your body. You're having a very constant level of energy, and without the fluctuation, you don't easily have those periods where you can get attacked by germs and viruses and bacteria, so you remain healthy due to having a strong immune system. Finally, when you do get sick, you have a strong immune system still, so the defense fights back very strong and you recover very quickly or very well. An example of somebody with Saturn in the sixth house that might illustrate this is an athlete, right? They're very strong and healthy and resilient, and they bounce back from injuries, etc. LeBron James is a good example then. Saturn in the sixth house in Scorpio, pretty much in a mutual square with its Lord, Mars. Now, on the flip side, if Saturn is negative in the sixth house, then you're not healthy, you're sick, you're weak. There's low or a slow digestion, and therefore there's not good use of nutrients, and the body lacks enough energy. You never really get enough rest because it never really has enough energy. Therefore, it's susceptible to invasion from the bacteria and the viruses and all that, so you get sick more often, and it takes longer for you to recover from the illness or injury. An example is Helen Keller. Just a fever just completely devastated her whole existence. And sure enough, she has Saturn debilitated in the sixth house. Now, on to the second theme. The sixth is the house of duties, and Saturn is a planet of work. So Saturn in the sixth house talks about your commitment to your duties. If it's positive, then you have great positive commitment to duties. So in other words, you're really reliable, you're very steady, you're very dependable. And the reason is that you actually respect yourself. There's a sense of self-respect that I am supposed to do this. Therefore, I'm not going to disrespect myself by not doing it. The native with a positive Saturn in the sixth feels self-worth by doing their work and doing it well and doing it reliably. A good example of a positive Saturn in the sixth house and a dutiful person is Krishna, the speaker of Bhagavad Gita, the book about duty. And interestingly, he has Saturn exalted in the sixth house with domicile Venus, its own lord. The other end of the same polarity is self-recrimination. You never feel like you did your job well enough. So you're constantly annoyed with yourself. You constantly feel that you've underperformed. This gives a kind of irritated nature that becomes also strict with other people and sort of hard line, in a sense, like uncompromising, unnegotiable, very intense. An example of such a person might be Mike Patton, the punk and metal singer extraordinaire. Another individual with Saturn debilitated in the sixth house. Now, let's talk about the third implication of Saturn in the sixth, the impact on wealth. The sixth has to do with debt. Saturn has to do with poverty. So if it's positive in the sixth, Saturn will really control the way that you incur poverty from debt. In other words, it will prevent you from incurring poverty as a result of debt. So what that really sums up to is you have great financial discipline. You have great restraint and intelligence in how you spend your money. So if you have 5 cents, you know how to use that 5 cents to make 50 cents. You don't just waste it on a lemon. A good example of this is Luciano Benetton, the entrepreneur and founder of the Benetton clothing company. Saturn in the sixth in Pisces, nearly trine to its own lord, and to Venus. The other end of the spectrum on this same theme, it's not financial discipline, it's financial indiscretion. You get 5 cents and you waste it. And then you wait until you get another 5 cents and then you waste it again. You get $50 and you waste that too, because you don't know how to spend money without incurring debt. So a good example of this is Amadeus Mozart. The guy had no financial discipline whatsoever. And in his case, it's an interesting chart because it's not that Saturn itself is negative in his sixth house. Saturn in his sixth house is positive. It's in its own sign, Aquarius. Yet, it is combusted by the Sun, who is the 12th lord. Mercury and Venus are also there in the sixth house, where they don't get on so well. And most interestingly of all, or most important of all, most significant of all, in showing somebody that doesn't really have the qualities of Saturn's patience, is that his chart is very nodal. It has Rahu right on the ascendant, and also showing financial indiscretion, it's Mars debilitated at 0 degrees in the 11th house. So as you see, the interpretation of any planet in any house really depends an awful lot on the positivity or negativity of that planet. So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the first house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the first house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall and Saturn in Libra is exalted. And there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic or the sun or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10. And the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If a planet is the lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the first, because the lord of the first wants to protect the whole chart, because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the 5th or the 9th. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the 4th or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing, or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry. You can do that. You can go to my website, victicara.com, click into the report section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart, or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. Also, just Saturn in the 7th house mostly affects universality. And we can break the concept of universality into 3 segments: bias, patience, and independence. When we talk about bias, what we're talking about is your bias in partnerships. And when we talk about patience, we mean how patient are you in interacting with those partnerships. And when we talk about independence, we mean how independent are you from having a home base. Let me explain why these are the 3 topics to interpret when Saturn is in the 7th house. Let's start with this bias in choosing partners. Saturn is the planet of commoners, common people. And the 7th is the house of people that you interact with. But because the very nature of Saturn is scrutinizing, the combination of Saturn in the 7th house is therefore really about how you select your partners from the common pool. The second subject of Saturn in the 7th, which is your patience in interactions, well, that's because Saturn has to do with being alone, being alienated and being alone. And the 7th house has to do with the opposite, being together. So what's being described when Saturn is in the 7th house is how well you can tolerate that antipolar urge, on the one hand to be together with other people, but on the other hand to get away from other people. And the third issue, which is your independence from having a home base, is because Saturn has to do with wandering, again, because it's about being alienated or exiled. And the 7th has to do with destinations, because it's literally the western horizon where the sun sets. And again, Saturn's overall theme is sadness and how well you deal with sadness. So Saturn in the 7th house, therefore, will describe how much you feel inconvenienced by having to leave your home. Now, that's all just a quick summary. We're going to get into detail about it all in this video. Don't worry if you don't exactly get it yet. Now, all of the themes of Saturn in the 7th house are going to depend upon how positive or negative Saturn is there. So what we should do is outline a positive and a negative permutation for each one of these 3 themes. For the first theme, your bias in selecting partners, on the positive side, Saturn in the 7th house makes you impartial about who you'll interact with. But on the negative side of that same theme, it's not that you're impartial, it's that you're indiscriminate. The second theme, which is your tolerance in partnerships, the positive version of that is that you're very patient with people. But the negative version of it is that you easily get irritated. As for the third theme, which is how independent you are from your home base, positive Saturn in the 7th house means you're quite independent, you travel often. Negative Saturn in the 7th house means you're very displaced, you're never really at home.
Now, these are the quick summary points for the positive and negative sides of each of the three themes. We're going to dive more deeply into what each one of these things actually implies. But first of all, you're probably wondering how you know whether you should interpret the positive side of Saturn in the 7th or the negative side of Saturn in the 7th. Well, it's all based on the positivity mainly of Saturn itself and alternatively of the whole chart overall. The more positive the whole chart and Saturn is, the more you stress on the positive interpretations. The more negative the whole thing is, the more you stress on the negative interpretations. And the more middle it is, the more you moderate the interpretations.
So I will explain how to figure that out at the end of this video. And also, if you're not the mathematical type, I figure it out for you in the reports that I offer. So if you want, you can go to my website, victicara.com, and order one of my reports, and it will tell you exactly how positive or negative, and therefore how much stress to put on either the positive or the negative traits.
Now let's get into more detail about the implications of each one of these keywords. So let's start off with being impartial and unbiased. What I'm saying here is positive Saturn in the 7th house is impartial about who they want to work with, who they want to deal with, who they want to relate with, who they want to be with. That means that they're very practical about selecting those people. They're very fair about it. They'll feel like grounded people. They'll feel like people who don't have their noses in the air. They'll feel like they're not elitists. And they're also very inclusive. Like they don't have prejudice or bias and rule people out just on the basis of some prejudged circumstance. Now, a negative Saturn in the 7th house, on the other hand, is not going to turn out to be the opposite of that. It's just going to turn out to be a negative result from that. So negative Saturn in the 7th house is indiscriminate. That was the key word. So what we mean by this is not really taking enough scrutiny of a potential partner. Being so open to commoners and so open to anybody that you just assume that this person is going to be okay. They're fine with me, or anybody's okay for me. I have no right to be picky. So if you look at some charts of famous people who have Saturn in the 7th house to illustrate these points, we've got Tracy Lords, the very early era porn star. So a very good example of just accepting anybody into an interpersonal relationship. And you can see that her Saturn in the 7th house is not just debilitated, but it's very exaggerated by its close contact with Rahu. We also have the example of Russell Brand. His Saturn in the 7th is not really doing great, and his whole chart is kind of martialized and aggressive because of it having only 3 signs occupied and having his moon with Mars in a Mars sign. Thirdly, we could also mention Johnny Depp because he's sort of famous for the Amber Heard incident or the trials, what have you. So also not very selective or careful about his partner. And if you look at his chart, it's obviously his Saturn in the 7th house is much better off than these other 2 people, but still it's the 6th lord in the 7th house. And it's relying on this very unstable moon due to its contact with Ketu. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, the positive variant, we have the example of Judy Blume. Hopefully you guys know who Judy Blume is because she's an extremely important author from a couple of decades ago. She wrote children's books about topics that weren't commonly explained to children. She is extremely liberal. She's extremely open-minded. She's extremely inclusive in her views. Now, her Saturn in the 7th might not look very great, but it's in a Neech Bhanga Raj Yoga. And also, it's not like it's just producing great things for her. She had 2 failed marriages, and only the 3rd one worked out well. So she also does have that indiscriminacy in partnerships. But the Neech Bhanga Raj Yoga is getting something really great out of Saturn in the 7th house, as well as the difficult stuff. Another example of Saturn in the 7th in a positive condition is Joe Biden, basically a liberal and inclusive type of politician. And his Saturn in the 7th is really good. Not only does it have pretty decent dignity, but it's in something called Adhi Yoga, while it's surrounded or hemmed by two exalted planets, the moon and Jupiter. Moving on to the second theme, how tolerant you are of other people when you're interacting with them. Positive Saturn in the 7th house is very patient with people. For example, if you have a conversation with this person, they are probably not going to get irritated with you right away if you don't understand what they're talking about immediately. If you're doing a business exchange with this person, they will be waiting for the deadlines that they're supposed to wait for, and they will kind of understand reasonable delays. They also tend to tolerate flaws in other people and understand those flaws and accept them. On the other hand, negative Saturn in the 7th house is pretty much exactly the opposite. It's very impatient when it's dealing with other people. So that will come off in like a conversation as you better understand what they're saying right away, otherwise they'll get annoyed or they won't explain it fully to you. You better be on time, for example, because they get impatient right away. If you're doing a business interaction with this person, you better be showing them progress, because they're easily going to get nervous that things are not on schedule and that you're not delivering what you're supposed to deliver. This is the type of person that kind of you might describe as having anger issues. It's not exactly an anger issue, but it's an irritation issue. They get annoyed easily. And then that annoyance builds up frustration, and then they act out in some kind of thing that appears to be anger. So as for people who have this, it's not so easy to really know these kind of personality traits in celebrities, at least not for me. And I'm not really interested in dedicating that much time to researching it. But I think it's safe to say that these same people that we used for the previous example are still pretty good examples here. Somebody like Judy Blume, Joe Biden, they're slow-paced, they are patient and tolerant and kind of easier to work with. Whereas these people like Russell Brand and probably Johnny Depp, definitely Johnny Depp, they have those kind of anger issues where it's frustration and irritation builds up inside of them and then it acts out in a sudden explosion. We come to the third topic, which is how independent are you from a home base? If Saturn in the 7th house is positive, then you really don't need a home base. Anywhere is your home base. You feel fine anywhere. You're very comfortable traveling. So you're always in the road and you like it, and you don't really have strong roots set down anywhere, but that doesn't make you feel unrooted. It makes you feel independent and free. So, for example, this is the kind of person who can travel with a backpack instead of a big suitcase. This is the kind of person who can do a lot of commuting even back and forth to work. It's not really about relocation to other places. It's about just being away from your base, being out on the road. But the negative version of this is displacement. In other words, you feel that you have been pushed out of your home. You feel that you have been exiled. You're on the road and you wish you had a place to rest that was your place. And so you feel kind of homeless. You feel kind of baseless and rootless. To consider some example charts for this, we have Ramana Maharshi and Kurt Cobain. Neither of these charts really have Saturn in particularly positive dignity. But Cobain's is in a chart that only has 3 signs occupied. Compare that to Ramana Maharshi, who has 7 signs occupied. In Cobain's chart, the 3rd and the 11th and Venus are very strong, very positive. And that is, in fact, what his 7th house, Saturn, is directly tied to by virtue of Saturn's lord, Jupiter, being the one that's in the 11th house, exalted with the moon, the 11th lord. And not only that, it's in a mutual aspect with that lord. So what you get with Kurt Cobain is he's an artist. The reason why he's always on the road, the reason why he's displaced is that he's an artist, or the way that it plays out that he's always on the road is that he's an artist. He's a musician, so he's always touring. Now, you know, Kurt Cobain's psychology and mental health wasn't good, and part of the reason is this Saturn in the 7th house, giving him this sense of not having a peaceful base. Ramana Maharshi, on the other hand, you might think, well, he should illustrate a positive Saturn, but his Saturn doesn't look too positive in this chart. Actually, Ramana Maharshi's life is not an easy, comfortable life either, by any stretch. In many ways, it's more austere than Cobain's. It's just that in Maharshi's chart, he's got this basis of having 7 signs occupied as opposed to 3, which really helps a lot. And also, his Saturn in the 7th isn't tied to 11th and 3rd house with artistic tendencies. His is tied to a house exchange between the 8th and the 2nd by virtue of Saturn's Lord being in that exchange. And that exchange of the 8th and the 2nd really highlights the dichotomy between materialism and spiritualism, between the manifest and the occult. So what's playing out with his Saturn in the 7th house is the reason why he doesn't need a home base is because he has some spiritual insight into the nature of bases, the nature of permanence, the nature of safety. So these are the things that you really need to know about Saturn in the 7th house if you want to interpret it accurately. Again, the only challenge in making any interpretation is how to scale the interpretation towards a positive side or a negative side.
So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the 1st house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the 1st house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall and Saturn in Libra is exalted. And there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic or the sun or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10, and the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If a planet is the lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the 1st, because the lord of the 1st wants to protect the whole chart, because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the 5th or the 9th. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the 4th or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing, or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry. You can do that. You can go to my website, victicara.com, click into the report section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart, or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. Also, you're going to want to watch this video on Saturn in the 8th house, if obviously you have Saturn in the 8th house. But also, if you have Saturn in the 8th house and any of the subdivisions, or even in the 8th sign from your rising sign, in any subdivision. Also, if you have Saturn giving a strong aspect, or if you just love astrology, let's break Saturn in the 8th house down to 3 key themes: sovereignty, sensitivity, and flaw awareness. Then we'll take each one of those themes and fan it out on a spectrum from positive to negative, so that we'll get 6 outcomes on these 3 poles. So let's talk first about the sovereignty element. The 8th house has to do with mating, which is partnering, right? But Saturn is a loner planet, so it's very solitary. So if you have Saturn in the 8th house, a big question is, how well are you going to do without a partner, without a mate? Maybe you're very sovereign, or maybe you feel kind of fear of being abandoned. The next issue with Saturn in the 8th house is sensitivity. That's because the 8th house has to do with penetration, but Saturn is impenetrable. So how are you going to penetrate into these situations that require sensitivity? Or how are you penetrated by sensitive things? So the spectrum here is going to be either you're very impervious or you're just very insensitive. The third and final major issue with Saturn in the 8th house is flaw awareness. That's because the 8th house is secret knowing and Saturn is very flaw finding. So with Saturn in the 8th house, the question becomes, how do you deal with flaws and mistakes? Are you an expert judge of them, or are you overly fixated on them, so you're a fault finder? So maybe you were expecting Saturn in the 8th to just represent this or that, A or B. But what I'm telling you here is Saturn in the 8th represents A and B, the positive and the negative permutations of particular themes. And it is the job of us as the reader of a chart with Saturn in the 8th to figure out the balance between the two. The way you do that primarily relies upon the dignity of Saturn in the 8th house, which primarily is a result of the sign that Saturn occupies in that house. If you want to know it in full detail, I have a report available on my website, and I'll put a link to that in the description below the video. You can please go and get one. Let me give you more detailed explanations of each one of these 3 poles, starting with the sovereignty. So what we're talking about here is, how productive are you without a partner? Or how reliant are you upon partners? So on the positive side, if you're okay without a partner, well, that indicates that you have sovereignty. You can do things by yourself, and you can stand up for yourself, and you understand yourself, and you do your own stuff. You don't need other people. Doesn't mean you hate other people, but you don't need them. You have your own ability to do things by yourself. So a person with a positive Saturn in the 8th house would be very self-sufficient and independent. But the negative version of this is the opposite of sovereignty. It's like dependency. So you would feel highly affected by not having a partner or being abandoned, and you would go out of your way to make sure that you keep your partners with you, even if it means compromising yourself. So people with negative Saturn in the 8th house often feel abandoned, alienated, or disregarded. Also, I want to mention, it's important to mention that this sovereignty issue of Saturn in the 8th has an effect on sexuality as well, because it's in the 8th house. And so it's also showing how much you care about social customs regarding sexuality and how much you're independent from them. So the next issue is sensitivity. The question is, how well do you handle sensitive situations? So with a positive Saturn in the 8th house, you will be impervious. Your sensitivity will never get in your way. Other people's little talking behind your backs, or the little snickers that people make when you walk by or fail or do something wrong, just don't bother you. You are unaffected by chit chat and chatter and gossip. But a negative Saturn in the eighth house is a bit different. It's an issue of Saturn being blunt in a place which is very penetrating. So the combination is like a blunt penetration, and that's pretty painful. So typically what you'll find is people just blurting things out, saying things very harshly without a lot of sensitivity to how sharp their words are or how forceful their words are. The third and final very important theme of Saturn in the eighth house is flaw awareness. And so we're asking, how do you deal with flaws? What's your focus in relation to flaws? If you have a positive Saturn in the eighth house, you have a positive relationship with flaws. You're very aware of them to your advantage. So you're like an expert judge because people can't hide things from you. You can really see when things are correct or incorrect easily. Your critique of any situation is very accurate. For anything where somebody doesn't know what the problem is, a positive Saturn in the eighth house is what we need, because that positive Saturn in the eighth house is going to see what the problem is right away or very clearly. Because it sees the problems so clearly, it's also got a really big head start on knowing how to solve problems. So people with positive Saturn in the eighth house are good fixers. They're good improvers. They're good reformers. Sometimes I describe positive Saturn in the eighth house as like a human lie detector. Negative Saturn in the eighth house, however, is quite the opposite in a way. These people are finding flaws all the time. They just can't stop. Even when the flaws aren't very big, they make a big deal of them. They don't notice anything else except flaws. So we can call them a fault finder. They feel very hypercritical or often hypocritical because they're always looking out at other people for finding flaws. They tend to have this kind of annoying flavor to them because they're so pessimistic and kind of discouraging. They are pretty darn argumentative because nobody likes to hear their flaws all the time, so they get into a lot of arguments. And interestingly, they become pretty paranoid because they are so aware of flaws, they're so aware of mistakes, they're so aware of the chance for something bad to be happening. They get worried all the time. So as I mentioned, you have these positive and negative spectrums for each one of the themes of a planet. And it makes a big difference between whether it's a positive version of Saturn in the eighth or a negative version of Saturn in the eighth. And the way you figure that out is really crucially important. It's mostly by dignity, but there's quite a few details involved in really getting it accurate. I have reports available on my website that will sort out your positivity and negativity for each of your planets and each of your houses. I'll put the link to that in the description below. But I also want to show you some examples of well-known people who have Saturn in the eighth house and how they illustrate these various points. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the chart because it's kind of overwhelming for a simple topic like a planet in a house. But I'll put the basic details about what's important in this chart in the description below. So as for examples for the sovereignty issue, it's pretty difficult to find a famous person who would be negative on the scale of sovereignty because that means they're dependent on other people and they wouldn't really become independently well known. But I can show you a contrast between two types of famous politicians or political activists. And that will illustrate the difference between a positive eighth house Saturn and a negative eighth house Saturn. So for negative eighth house Saturn, it's Benito Mussolini. And for positive, it's Martin Luther King. So with Benito Mussolini, you can see how dependent he is on his partnerships. He's extremely reliant on Hitler, and he allowed practically most of his philosophies to be redefined by Hitler. So with Mussolini, you see a person who really wouldn't have become the famous Benito Mussolini without his partner, Hitler. And also you could see how he pandered to his partner. Whereas if you contrast that with Martin Luther King Jr., Martin Luther King Jr. Was extremely self-contained and sovereign. And he was standing for what he believed in, although it was extremely unpopular. That's the kind of thing that you can do when you have positive Saturn in the 8th house. Now, to illustrate the sensitivity principle of Saturn in the 8th house, we can keep Mussolini up there because he's, amazingly insensitive. Also, there's two important French serial killers. With positive Saturn in the 8th house, you get imperviousness to public opinion, and also you would get better sensitivity. So, interestingly, a lot of artists have positive Saturn in the 8th house. For example, Salvador Dali, a really great example of someone who's very impervious to public opinion and really just is himself and comes up with his own ideas and his own imagery. Also, Frida Kahlo, another great example of the same principle. And also Michelangelo. And for the final aspect of Saturn in the 8th house, the flaw awareness, I think we can keep those same three negative examples up there for people who are very, very flaw-oriented. You see these three people, the serial killers and Mussolini, they would intensely study the prey. So they're very, very flaw-aware all the time, but they're also very negative people. On the positive side, you should have people who are able to see things that other people can't see. People who are able to see very deeply, right? So Sigmund Freud has positive Saturn in the 8th house. Good example of psychological skills, the ability to see how the mind is working and the ability to figure out how to fix problems in something so abstract and invisible. And also Edgar Cayce is another good example of positive Saturn in the 8th house, the ability to see what other people can't see. So I'm pretty sure you can see pretty well now how important this positivity versus negativity thing is when you're interpreting Saturn in the 8th house or any planet in any house. To know the positivity of your Saturn, you can largely just rely on the dignity, if you understand how to do dignity. If you don't understand dignity, look it up on my channel because I have quite a few videos about it. I will also put a link in the description below so that you could get a report on your birth chart that will calculate for you your positivity and negativity of your planets and your houses and give you the appropriate interpretations. And also in the description below, if you're kind of more intermediate in astrology, not a beginner, there's some notes on the example charts that explain the key point and why I considered that particular Saturn in that particular example to be either positive or negative. So as you see, the interpretation of any planet in any house really depends an awful lot on the positivity or negativity of that planet. So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the first house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the first house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall and Saturn in Libra is exalted. And there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic or the sun or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10. And the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If a planet is the lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the first, because the lord of the first wants to protect the whole chart because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the 5th or the 9th. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the 4th or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing, or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry. You can do that. You can go to my website, victicara.com, click into the report section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart, or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. Also, just what we're going to talk about in this video on Saturn in the 9th house obviously is going to be very relevant to you if you have Saturn in the 9th house. But there are more ways than you might be aware of to have Saturn in the 9th house or something with a similar effect. The most obvious way is to have Saturn in the 9th sign from your rising sign. But another way to get Saturn in the 9th house is to have Saturn in that 9th sign in any of your subdivisions or in the 9th sign of a subdivision. Also, what we're going to talk about will definitely feel relevant to you whenever you have Saturn even transiting your 9th house. Okay, so then what is this Saturn in the 9th house thing all about? Well, essentially, the essence of it is the stability of your fortune. And we can explore that topic in 3 themes: adversity, support, and judgmentalism. Now, the key thing to understand is that each one of these 3 themes can play out in either a positive or a negative way, or usually somewhere in between, depending on the conditions of Saturn in your 9th house. So we're going to get a positive and negative spectrum for each one of these 3 themes, giving us a total of 6 keywords that we need to focus on to be able to interpret Saturn in the 9th effectively. So obviously, being able to tell whether or not your Saturn is positive or negative in your 9th house is really crucial to being able to do effective interpretation. We'll talk about that soon, and also I'll tell you about reports that I have that help you do that. For now, let me show you an overview of what these 3 key themes of Saturn in the 9th really are and where they come from. The theme of misfortune comes from the fact that the 9th is the house of fortune, but Saturn is the planet of misfortune. And so when Saturn is in the 9th, the big question that it draws to mind is, how do you fare with misfortunes? On the positive side of the spectrum, maybe you're an underdog. Or on the negative side of the spectrum, maybe you're very downtrodden. Now, as for the second theme, that is about support. So what we're talking about here is the fact that the 9th house is the house that indicates your culture, your background, the culture that comes to you through elders and role models. But Saturn is an outcast. So when Saturn is in the 9th house, it's asking the question of what kind of role models we have. So if it's very positive you're in the 9th house, then you have very inspiring role models. And if it's negative here in the 9th house, then you have very disappointing role models. And the last very important theme of Saturn in the 9th is judgmentality. So the ninth is the house of morals. And Saturn is a planet which is very judgmental or critical. So with Saturn in the ninth house, the question that comes to mind is, how do you judge people? If we're looking at a positive Saturn in the ninth house, then it looks like you are very egalitarian and rational in your judgment. If we're looking at a negative Saturn in the ninth house, it looks like you're very cynical and jaded. So now we've identified and enumerated our 6 keywords on these 3 themes, each with a positive and negative pole. So again, we come to face the reality that it's very important to be able to decide whether a particular Saturn in a chart is positive or negative, or more accurately put, where it is on the spectrum between the two. So I'll include a bonus segment at the end of the video that explains how to do it. And I'll give you a quick hint right now, is that you can basically get by just on dignity alone, like just on sign dignity, the dignity that Saturn has as a result of the sign that it's in the ninth house. And in fact, when we do the examples at the end of the video, I'll try to base it entirely on sign dignity. And also, I have reports available on my website that you can order for your birth chart that will exactly sort out where your Saturn or any planet is in the spectrum between positive and negative, and what that implies to the interpretations for your chart. So please have a look at that by the link in the description below, or you can go to my site, victorcara.com, click into readings and order the readings. The basic module will be fine. The subdivisions module will give the same thing for all of your subdivisions as well. Before we rush into anything though, let's make sure that you're really clear about what these keywords really mean and what we're really talking about as far as the symbolism. So let's start with adversity. We're asking the question of, how do you deal with misfortunes? And we identify 2 polarities. On the one hand, maybe you're an underdog, and on the other hand, maybe you're downtrodden. So let me just explain what I mean by that. If you're an underdog, then you're the kind of person who prospers through adversity. Like, challenges and obstacles bring out the best in you, and they cause you to rise up and give it your all. You succeed when challenged. You thrive on difficulty. You thrive on challenges. You have this underdog quality, which means you can come from below. You can rise up from below, rags to riches, against the odds, that kind of thing. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, being downtrodden, it means that challenges feel extremely oppressive. You feel very oppressed. You feel boxed in and afraid to step out anywhere because you feel weak in the face of aggressors and adversaries and obstacles. So with a positive Saturn, an underdog type of person feels a lot of invincibility. They feel a lot of like, okay, come at me, let's go. I'm ready for a fight, because even if I lose, I'll get stronger. Whereas the other kind of person, the downtrodden person, is always just sort of in anxiety and worried and feeling helpless, facing problems that you know you can't overcome. That kind of feeling is to be downtrodden. So let me bring out one more corollary trait of each one of these sides of the story. If you are an underdog, then you're also an ambitious type of person. You're enterprising. You're brave and courageous and kind of fearless. Yeah, you're not afraid of facing challenges, so you will actually go into challenging circumstances kind of eagerly. And you're not the kind of person to be timid or acquiescent. On the other hand, the downtrodden personality type with Saturn negative in the ninth house, it's the opposite. You're unambitious. You just wish time would pass. You just wish that the clouds would go away. You're not resourceful. You can't think of ways to overcome your problem. So instead, you become very indentured to others. You're always looking for help from others. So you become indebted and indentured kind of dependent all the time. Now let's move on and talk about the second key thing about Saturn in the ninth house, which is your support. You know, what kind of role models were giving you support? So on the one hand, maybe you had very inspirational role models if you have a positive Saturn in the ninth house. On the other hand, maybe you have very disappointing role models if you have a negative Saturn in the ninth house. So let me flesh this out a little bit more for you so you understand this and what the direct impact of it is. When I say role models, I'm talking mostly about the elders in your upbringing. Like the family that was senior to you, that is supposed to be taking care of you and inspiring you on the right path and sheltering you from harm. That's what we mean by the ninth house role models. If you have inspirational role models, then that obviously means that your role models were there for you. They showed up and they did what they're supposed to do. So that means that one thing, they were very reliable. They didn't disappear when you expected them to be there. The other thing is they're very dutiful. They did the things that they were supposed to do, like feed you, clothe you, explain to you how to do things. And the third thing is that they were supportive or encouraging of you and your own growth. That's very important for a positive role model. So conversely, what do we mean by a disappointing role model? It's just the opposite. I mean, these people just were not there for you. They did not show up. So they were unreliable. You know, when you needed them to be there, all of a sudden they disappeared because, oh, they forgot about you, or, oh, they were playing a game, or, oh, they had to go to the bar, or, oh, they had to go to a drink, or whatever it is. They weren't dutiful. They couldn't, you know, put the pedal to the metal and just do the stuff they're supposed to do. And three, especially, a disappointing role model is one who is not very empathetic or sympathetic to you, therefore not very supportive. They're condescending and crushing of you. So those, unfortunately, are the kind of role models that people get with a negative Saturn in the ninth house. Now I want to show one further implication on each side of the story. If you were blessed with a positive Saturn in your ninth house and inspiring role models, the implication of that is you know how to be a role model yourself. It comes naturally. And that is also going to impact your bravery again, your confidence. You won't shy away from positions of importance. You won't shy away from playing roles where people really depend on you because you have a good experience of that. And you've seen how it works and you know how to emulate it, you know how to do it. So people who have a good history of role models, they also tend to become good role models themselves. And with it coming out of Saturn in the ninth house, it tends to mean that they overcame some challenges, either facing the role models or by the help of the role models. And it gives them a sense, not just being a good role model in general, but being like a very heroically inspirational person. Like, wow, this person was able to accomplish this. That's inspiring. That becomes a role model for me. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, the secondary ramification of having disappointing role models is you just don't trust the role model system in general, nor do you really trust that you would perform well in that system because you didn't get any firsthand experience of how it works. So the not always so well understood ramification of not having a good role model is that it makes you shy, or it makes you shy away from positions of power, positions of importance, positions where people depend on you. Because those situations make you really nervous and you kind of doubt in yourself and you feel like you're not going to be able to show up and be there for those people. This will also impact on both sides your ability to parent. With a positive Saturn in the ninth house, a person kind of gravitates naturally towards parenting and does a good job at it. They're dutiful, they're responsible, and they're encouraging. But with a negative Saturn in the ninth house, it's the opposite effect. The person gravitates or shies away from parenting because they have a feeling like they're just not cut out for it and they don't want to harm a child like in the way that they were harmed. Now, next up, we have our final trait, the final of the three important traits of Saturn in the ninth, which is judgmentalism. how well do you judge people? On one hand, maybe you're very egalitarian and rational about how you judge people. That's if you have a positive Saturn in the ninth. If you have a negative Saturn in the ninth, then you're very cynical about people and you judge them harshly, kind of unfairly. So let me flesh out exactly what we're talking about with this. If you have a positive Saturn in the ninth house and you're egalitarian, that means that you give people equal opportunity and you are free from prejudice. Prejudice means judging something before you evaluate it. A positive Saturn in the ninth is free from that. They wait and they allow everybody to demonstrate themselves, to practically show their worth, and then they evaluate fairly. So this kind of person with Saturn positive in the ninth house is the type that is not very impressed by how you look. And they're not very impressed by what car you drive. And they're not very impressed by what family you're born into or whatever, how much money you make. This is the kind of person that is impressed by what you actually do. On the other side of the spectrum, if Saturn is negative in the ninth house, then you have a cynical or jaded type of judge. So this person really is just not impressed at all, no matter what. They have a prejudice, actually, and the prejudice is negative, but it's equally distributed to everybody. It's not like a specific prejudice against a specific type of person. They're just negative, pessimistic, cynical, and jaded. Now, this both affects how you deal with ideas. If you are very egalitarian and objective about how you evaluate things, then it's not just about how you evaluate people, it's also about how you evaluate ideas. So with a positive Saturn in the ninth house, you also get like a very objective and fair rationality and intellect. Whereas with negative Saturn in the ninth house, you get an overly pessimistic, dismissive intellect. So the person with positive Saturn in the ninth house is rational overall and very fair and very objective, kind of like scientific or logical in their approach to things. Whereas the person with negative Saturn in the ninth house is of course going to be distrustful and everything of everybody, but there's a little twist to it as well. Because they feel like they can't trust anything and because they disbelieve everything, negative Saturn in the ninth house tends to come up with its own far-fetched reasons for things. It comes up with its own weird ideas. A positive Saturn in the ninth house evaluates things directly in a straightforward way. And if it's a negative evaluation, it says, no, I don't like you. A negative Saturn in the ninth house is afraid to do that. But it still needs to do that. And so it still tries to get it done behind the scenes, and it becomes passive aggressive and subversive in how it tries to accomplish whatever it feels like it needs to accomplish. Also, the negative Saturn coming up with all these ideas of its own because it doesn't believe anything. It tends to be very conspiratorial. It comes up with feeling like the whole world is against it. Everybody's conspiring against me, but I'm the only one who can see that this XYZ thing is actually true. Now, to clarify all this even further, I'll now show you examples of well-known people who have Saturn in the ninth house to illustrate all of these interpretations. Now, the key is to be able to differentiate the positive Saturn from the negative Saturn. So in these examples, I tried to keep it as simple as possible and as directly related to sign dignity as possible. So in other words, the dignity that Saturn has simply by virtue of the obvious sign that is the ninth house is going to be the determinant in these examples of whether Saturn is positive or negative as far as possible. Actually speaking, that's only one of the steps in determining whether Saturn is positive or negative. At the end of the video, I'll give you a bonus section explaining in much more detail about how to do that yourself. And also I'll give you links to my website in the description below, where you can go and get reports about your own chart to see how your planets stack up in terms of positivity and negativity and what kind of interpretations they bring forth as a result for you. Let's start by illustrating the principle of adversity. How well do you deal with adversity? Are you an underdog or are you downtrodden? So for positive examples, Kamala Harris has Saturn in Aquarius, its own masculine sign, in the ninth house. And it is a very good example of an underdog, and is also the example of a Harrison Ford, who was a very big underdog in Hollywood. Like, nobody expected this guy to become successful as an actor, yet he became one of the most successful actors in history. His Saturn is in Gemini in the ninth house, which gives it the flair towards acting and gives it a decent dignity. It's also with Venus there, which again is giving it the flair for art and acting and expression, and gives it more dignity since Venus is its friend. And in fact, since Saturn is the yoga car and Venus is the first lord, this puts Saturn in Raj Yoga in the ninth house, which is something that really contributes to positivity. As far as negative examples of adversity, it's obviously not that easy to find examples of famous people who are downtrodden, because look at the interpretation of downtrodden that we specified. It's the person who's timid and is afraid to go and get out of their box, and they're afraid to face the challenges. So you don't find that many famous people with this. However, you could look at Tina Turner's chart. Now, Tina Turner is much more actually of an underdog than a downtrodden. So it's easy to kind of put Tina Turner in the negative category because her Saturn is in the ninth house in Aries, and that means it's debilitated. But it's also equally easy to see that you shouldn't really stress these negative interpretations for her because A, her Saturn is there in the ninth house in Raja Yoga with Ketu, similar to Harrison Ford. And B, she has a Leo ascendant, which is resistant to that effect. And her first lord is strong in Sagittarius in the fifth house. But like I said, it's hard to find somebody that is famous and is really going to exemplify this quality. So here's something close. Okay, now let's move on to this example of support. What kind of role models do you have? You have very inspirational role models, or do you have very disappointing role models? So Franklin Delano Roosevelt is a big role model and also an underdog. How would I justify calling him a role model? Essentially, the historians usually consider him one of the three most important and popular presidents of the United States. So, that means that he's a role model. A lot of people look up to him and think that he did really great things and accomplished really great things. You find his Saturn in the ninth house in Taurus, which is its friend's sign, and it's with Jupiter in a Raja Yoga. Then for an example of disappointing role models, for this one, Tina Turner fits the bill because she was abandoned by her parents, more or less emotionally abandoned. And so that Saturn in Aries, debilitated in the ninth house, can really show itself clearly in this regard, because it's not going to be counteracted by her strong Leo. And the Raja Yoga also isn't really going to help it. But the Raja Yoga will help the side effects of it. And the strong Leo ascendant will help the side effects of it, making her as an individual be strong, like in spite of the weakness of the role models. And finally, if we look for examples of the judgmentalism, are you going to be egalitarian and objective in your judgments, or are you going to be cynical and jaded? You have Enrico Fermi, one of the most important physicists. He's dubbed as the architect of the nuclear age. Whereas his Saturn, it's in Capricorn. So that means it's basically got to be positive in his ninth house. So he gets that objective, rational evaluation of things. Also, Immanuel Kant, one of the most significant Western philosophers, rational, objective, a clear thinker, a fair evaluator. As for a cynical person, like a person whose judgment is not very good, and a person who tends to be subversive and deal with conspiracies, guess who? Bernie Madoff, the man behind the biggest Ponzi scheme in history, one of the biggest financial criminals in history. subversive, conspiratorial, poor judgment. Where's the Saturn in the ninth house? What sign is it in? What dignity does it have? It's in Aries. It's debilitated. So there we have all the nuts and bolts of Saturn in the ninth house on 3 themes spread into 2 polarities, positive and negative polarity, for a total of 6 key ideas. Now, right after this, I'm going to attach a bonus section explaining how I really figure out the positivity or negativity of a planet, because that's so crucial to understanding what the real interpretation is. Before I give you that section, let me just remind you to go to my website, vicdecara.com. The link is in the description below. Click into the reports section, and you can order either the basic chart report, or you can also add in the subdivisions module, or you can get any report that you want. But if you get one of those 2, then what you've been seeing in this video will be done for you, for your chart, for every planet, not just Saturn. So I'll lay out exactly where your planets lie on the positivity negativity spectrum and what interpretations that provides for you. So please check that out in the link below. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, support it, like it, share it, and enjoy this last segment about the technical details. So as you see, the interpretation of any planet in any house really depends an awful lot on the positivity or negativity of that planet. So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the first house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the first house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall and Saturn in Libra is exalted. And there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic, or the sun, or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10, and the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If a planet is the lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the first, because the lord of the first wants to protect the whole chart, because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the 5th or the 9th. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the 4th or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing, or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry, you can do that. You can go to my website, vicdecara.com, click into the report section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart, or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. Also, what we're going to talk about in this video about Saturn in the 10th house is going to be relevant to you if, of course, you have Saturn in the 10th house. But there's a lot of other ways that it would be relevant to you, or you might have Saturn in the 10th house without it obviously being in the 10th house. How could that be? For example, if it's in the 10th sign from your moon, or even from the sun, or if it's in the 10th sign from your ascendant, in any of its subdivisions, or if it's in the 10th house of any of the subdivision charts. You'll even find this information in the video relevant if you have Saturn in a place that aspects your 10th house, or even at specific times in your life when Saturn is transiting points that are in your 10th house. Basically, Saturn in the 10th house is an indicator of power. And we can break this concept of power down into 3 themes. The first is that you're irrepressible. The second is that you are rational. And the third is that you're very enduring. Now, each of these 3 themes might evolve in a positive or negative way, depending on the conditions that Saturn is in, as it's in your 10th house. So what we'll do in the video is explore both ends of the spectrum for each of the 3 themes. So we're going to explore 6 keywords in total. The key to understanding whether or not the positive or the negative permutations of an interpretation are relevant to you is to understand whether or not Saturn in your 10th house is positive or negative. I will explain how to do that at the end of the video. Also, that's exactly what I do for you in the reports and the readings that I offer on my website. So I have a link to my reports in the description below. You could specifically get just a basic chart report, or you could go all the way into your subdivisions report. You get any reports that you like, really. All of them follow this format of assessing the positivity and negativity and interpreting accordingly. So now let's start with this first theme, Saturn in the 10th house being irrepressible. Why? It's because the 10th house signifies the public, and so does Saturn. Saturn signifies the masses. So when Saturn is in the 10th house, it's talking about how you govern and assert your own power so that you influence society. The world is a place that both influences us and gets influenced by us. And the planets in the 10th house talk about that, how the world influences us versus how we influence the world. Saturn in the 10th house has a lot of potential to exert a lot of influence. That's why I'm calling it irrepressible. Like, it's able to exert more influence than the influence can be exerted on it. So if it wants to go this way, nothing can stop it from going that way. But we have positive and negative possibilities for all of these. So what are the positive and negative possibilities of irrepressibility? Well, negatively speaking, maybe you're just uncontrollable and rowdy. Or positively speaking, you must be very powerfully influential on society. So when we talk about being powerfully influential, let me give you some more details about that. Saturn in the 10th house in a positive condition really resonates with a lot of people. Like, people will feel connected to you. People will feel like you represent them. People will feel like you get them, you understand them, and they'll feel like they understand and get you and resonate with you. Therefore, the effect is that they kind of respond like iron aligning with a magnet. They kind of align themselves to you because they feel sameness with you. And so, therefore, positive Saturn in the 10th house allows a native to very easily direct, lead, organize, influence, and so on. Now, let me give you some more information about the negative side of irrepressibility, which means being uncontrollable, being rowdy. So in this one, it's the same thing, really. It's just a negative permutation. You really resonate with regular people. Therefore, you don't resonate with the people in power. That's the negative. Now we're bringing out the negative side of the thing. Rather than bringing out the positive side that you resonate with people well, it's now focusing on who you therefore don't resonate with. Not the people, but the rulers. So Saturn negatively in the 10th house has a lot of distrust of leaders and cultural, religious, moral norms. Saturn in the 10th house stubbornly refuses to conform and comply with those directions and leaders and norms. What Saturn negative in the 10th house actually does is it feels happy by being disruptive, by disrupting the norms. Now let's talk about the second trait. Why does Saturn in the 10th house have to do with how rational you are? It's because the 10th house is about tangible, objective, practical things. And so is Saturn. Saturn is about tangible, objective, practical things. So when Saturn is in the 10th house, what comes to mind is how well do you function with practical, tangible, objective things? In other words, how objective are you? How rational are you? How practical are you? The negative version of Saturn in the 10th house is not going to make you irrational. It's just going to give you a negative side effect of being very rational. So the negative permutation of Saturn in the 10th house is unempathetic. In other words, it's a person that's all logic, all objectivity, very objectivity. So that's cold. Not very sensitive, not very emotionally aware. On the positive side, Saturn in the 10th house gives you strong logic. What do I mean by logic? I mean, your thinking, your way of experiencing the world is very objective and practical. You look for actual evidence. You look for actual effects. You look for actual outcomes. You don't just believe in things or hope things. You're very realistic in how you assess things. So this kind of objective, practical, logical assessment of the world is basically the same thing as the definition of scientific process. So Saturn in the 10th house in a positive condition gives an effect that we could sum up with the word scientific. But now let's just expand a little bit on the negative side of Saturn's rationality in the 10th house. Like I said, it means lack of empathy. So here's a person that's very into tangible, practical, real things, and therefore is blind to all of the rest of the reality that is intangible. So we could say it's kind of like an emotionally deaf person, a person that isn't sympathetic, isn't empathetic, doesn't really see things from other people's point of view, doesn't understand subjectivity, doesn't understand contextuality. Finally, let's discuss the third pillar for interpreting Saturn in the 10th house, which is the concept of being very enduring. The reason for this is that the 10th house is the big open sky. And it's the place where the wind is blowing, drying everything out and blowing everything away. So the 10th house signifies exposure to the elements or exposure to the world, as well as dispersion, like being spread around and out into the public and out into the world, being dispersed. Putting Saturn in this house is very interesting because on one hand, Saturn is not a planet that moves easily. But on the other hand, Saturn is a planet that loves to shed, loves to get rid of things that it deems unworthy. So if you see Saturn in the 10th house, the question in the mind as you read the chart is, how does this person sustain their efforts? How do they sustain themselves? How do they sustain their energies? So it really has a widespread effect, actually. It's not just on your tenacity, but also on like your spending habits. How do you spend your energy? If Saturn is very negative in the 10th house, then you're the type of person that is easily exhausted. You get winded right away. You run out of energy fast. It also means that you run out of resources fast. You put everything into a project right away, and then you don't have anything left in reserve. Compare that with the positive version of Saturn's endurance in the 10th house. You're unstoppable. You keep having your enthusiasm, which wasn't this big bang, go get 'em enthusiasm, gung ho. like some other more dramatic type people might be. But it's this steady, relentless enthusiasm and energy. For expenses, it's the same thing. You avoid just spending everything all at once. Therefore, you spend consistently over a long period of time. You have a lot of resources over a long period. So you never come into a point where you're totally depleted. So to elaborate a little bit more on this unstoppable thing, Saturn in the 10th house in a positive condition is an unstoppable person. Like walls don't stop you. Doors don't stop you. Barriers don't stop you. You know, these like walls that people put up around themselves, or the barriers that people put up between what you can do and you can't do, you manage to get past that. No, you'll never be able to achieve that. This is your limit. That doesn't apply to a positive Saturn in the 10th house. The positive Saturn in the 10th house will break through that wall. This type of person surpasses expectations. Wow, we didn't expect a person like this to do that. They beat the odds, they defy limits. So classically, Saturn here is like an underdog, a person that you didn't think was going to win, but they won. Or rags to riches, rise to fame. On the other hand, for the negative permutation of Saturn in the 10th house on this theme of endurance, well, you're just easily exhausted, right? So that means you spend your energy and your enthusiasm too abruptly, then you come into this like lull period where you don't have any left, and that lasts for a while. And during that period, if you encounter a problem or a snag or a setback, it just stops you in your tracks. Small problems feel big. You get tired easy dealing with things that are relatively simple. If you had energy and enthusiasm, it wouldn't be hard to do this. But because you already lost all the enthusiasm, this thing feels so tiresome. This thing feels so burdensome. So negative Saturn in the 10th house gives up easily. Contrasting with the positive Saturn in the 10th house, it's very endurant and tenacious, and it doesn't give up. It keeps applying its energy. So I'm sure you're really interested to know whether your Saturn is positive or negative in your 10th house. So I'll show you that again at the end of the video. And that is what I tell you if you order my birth chart reports from my site, which is linked in the description below, or you can just go to vicdecara.com and you can pretty easily find the readings button there and go into the readings. I want to illustrate these three pillars of interpreting Saturn in the 10th house by using some examples of well-known people. So the first pillar of Saturn in the 10th was to be irrepressible. On the positive side, we should have some powerfully influential people. And indeed, Pablo Picasso, who's hugely influential artist, Agatha Christie, the world's most influential fiction writer, Albert Einstein, the world's most intellectually influential person in recent history. Copernicus, extremely influential in the fields of science. Pope Benedict, a leader of a huge religion. Queen Victoria, the leader of an empire. I'll show you one of these people's charts each time. So Queen Victoria, for example, has Saturn in her 10th house is positive. Why? It's in a sign that it can be comfortable with, Pisces, but more importantly, it's in a Raj Yoga, which means a very powerful positive combination, because it's exchanging the 10th and the 9th lords. It's the 9th lord in the 10th house, while the 10th lord is in the 9th house, which is a big, gigantic Raj Yoga. So it makes her Saturn be interpreted very positively. So she comes out as a powerful influencer, not as uncontrollably rowdy. Now, for examples of uncontrollably rowdy people with Saturn in the 10th house, we got the famous candy bar, one of the most famous kind of original famous strippers, and Charles Manson, the infamous criminal. Now, take a look at Charles Manson's chart. His Saturn in his 10th house looks like it's good because it's in its own sign, Aquarius. But the whole rest of his chart is not good, especially the situation going on with his moon. So you can, in fact, give him the positive interpretation of being a huge influencer, because he was a huge cultural influence. But also he's got that negative trait coming in from just the whole negative environment that his Saturn is in his chart, of being just a disruptor to society. Now let's have a look at the second pillar for interpreting Saturn in the 10th house, the rationality of it. Saturn in the 10th is very rational. So we should have some very logical people with positive Saturns in the 10th house, some very scientific people. Who do we have? As I mentioned already, Einstein, Copernicus. We also have Carl Sagan and Swami Vivekananda. Take a look at Sagan's chart. It's so interesting because he's born very, very close to Charles Manson, and their charts are almost identical, except for the moon. So remember what I said about Manson's chart? It actually looks like we should interpret this as a positive Saturn, except that the rest of his chart is in a negative condition, especially the moon. Sagan's chart is like a living example of what Charles Manson's chart would have been like were his moon in a different place. So there you get the moon out of that difficult situation, and you can just give Saturn a clear positive interpretation. How about the negative version of the rationality of Saturn in the 10th house being unempathetic and unsympathetic? Charles Manson again. Pablo Picasso, incredibly unempathetic, unsympathetic. Albert Einstein, insanely, autistically unsympathetic and unempathetic. Let's take a look at Einstein's chart for a second. His Saturn is like the opposite of Manson's. So actually what's going on with his Saturn is very complicated. It is in debilitation, but it's also in a Neech-Bhang Raj Yoga. Neech-Bhang Raj Yoga. Neech-Bhang Raj Yoga means a very powerful combination which changes the effects of the debilitation. So what happens is, in Einstein's case, he has the traits of both the positive and the negative Saturn, because it's debilitated, but in a yoga which changes the effects of the debilitation. Finally, the third pillar for interpreting Saturn in the 10th house is the endurance of it. So also Queen Victoria, Agatha Christie are very good examples of people that are unstoppable, defying odds, beating odds. And also a new person to add to this list is Muhammad Ali. You take a look at Ali's chart, very good dignity, also in a Raj Yoga, also in a house exchange. As for the negative permutation of endurance, to be easily exhausted, well, you wouldn't really usually be very famous, would you, if you have this trait? So it's not really so feasible to find this in celebrity charts and show it to you as an example, but Albert Einstein could probably be used as an example of illustrating this easily exhausted thing. Just look how exhausted the guy always looked. But like I said, he has a Neech-Bhang Raj Yoga, so he's got these simultaneous good and bad traits. So he's constantly exhausted, but never stops working. So at this point, I think you should really have a great understanding of what Saturn represents in the 10th house and how to interpret it. The only thing left is to explain how to sort out the positivity from the negativity, to know which side of the pole you should stress, or how much you should stress on either side. That's what I'll tell you now in the next section of the video. I'll explain how to sort out dignity, basically. And one last reminder, that's what I do for you in the reports that I offer for my website. So please go to my website with the link in the description below, victorcara.com, click into the readings section and order a couple of them. So as you see, the interpretation of any planet in any house really depends an awful lot on the positivity or negativity of that planet. So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the first house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the first house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall and Saturn in Libra is exalted. And there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how do you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic or the sun or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10. And the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If a planet is the lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the first, because the lord of the first wants to protect the whole chart, because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the 5th or the 9th. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the 4th or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing, or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry. You can do that. You can go to my website, victicara.com, click into the report section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart, or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. Also, just to understand Saturn in the 11th house, let's break it down into 3 themes: social impact, personal networks, and income. These are the things that are going to be center stage if you're interpreting Saturn in the 11th house. Now let's take each theme and split it into a positive and a negative variation so that we wind up with 6 interpretive ideas on 3 polarities. This is exactly the way I do it in all my readings, all my reports. So if you like the way this works in the video, you'll probably love to get one of my reports or readings. And I'll show you how to do that later. The link is in the description below. So let's look at that first theme, social impact. The 11th house has to do with the effects that come to us from society, because it's on the eastern side of the upper part of the sky. The upper part of the sky is society, the eastern side is the self. So the 11th house, which is on the eastern side of the upper portion, is how society affects you, what you get from society. So let's say it's the effects of society, and Saturn represents most of the people in society, the masses. So if Saturn is in the 11th house, the question that pops to mind is, how much impact do you have on society? Because you have a potential to impact a lot of the people. To split this concept into a positive and negative pole, if it's positive, then you have great mass appeal. And if it's negative, you still have appeal, but it's underground or somehow doesn't work out to your advantage or the way that you would want it to. Let's look at each one of those concepts. The positive version is mass appeal and a lot of effect on society. So in other words, you'll be able to significantly affect people. It's not so much that you significantly affect the bosses and the leaders. It's more like you significantly affect the masses. And then by force of numbers, that's what changes society. That's what impacts society. So positive Saturn in the 11th has a lot of impact and lasting impact on society, or at least on your social circles. Whatever the scope of your chart is, whatever the scope of your destiny is, the scope of your social circles might be different. It might be the entire globe, or it might just be your block in your neighborhood. But regardless of the size of your social circle, if Saturn is in the 11th house positive, then you have the dominant influence on that social circle. Also, I mentioned that it's not really that you're affecting the leaders. So remember, Saturn is like an anti-leader. So what's going to happen with Saturn in the 11th positive is that people are going to want to follow you, even though you're not really putting yourself in the position of being a leader. That's not your intention. But by default, your appeal to people causes them to want you to be their leader, to want you to advise them and direct them and tell them what's right and wrong, tell them what to do and what not to do. So the mass effect and mass appeal of this positive Saturn in the 11th means that you have a really significant lasting impact on your social circle, and that you tend to wind up as the unofficial de facto leader. The negative version of this is that you still have that kind of appeal, but it's not really, something about it is weird, or something about it doesn't work the way you want. So you might wind up being the actual influence on society, but not having people know that it's you that's influencing society. So you might be like an underground influencer. That might sound confusing, but if you grew up the way I grew up, most of the people that I grew up with fit that description exactly. They're the people that made the mainstream culture of the 2000s. They made it in 1980s, and you have no idea who they are. But because the artists from the 90s knew these underground people from the 80s, you got your mainstream influence in the 2000s. So that's what I mean by a Saturn that's in the 11th house, but not really all that positive. Another possibility, depending on how things look in the chart, is that you are known as the influencer, but your association, like the influence that you're giving, or the cause that you're championing, or the things that you're trying to, influence, are associated with minority groups, like groups that aren't that popular, or that people look down on, or that people ostracize, so minority groups, or defeated causes. So that was the positive and negative version for mass appeal. Let's take a look at the second theme now, which is your personal networks. Saturn in the 11th is definitely going to affect our personal networking. It is kind of the same as your social influence, but it's slightly different. It's more of the personal side of the social impact. So the reason why Saturn in the 11th has this effect is that the 11th house is about your personal networks. Sometimes we say it's about friends, but it's not really about friends that are like stick with you through thick and thin, friends that you would sacrifice your life for, or sacrifice at least your lunch money for. Not that kind of friends. It's just like friends, like when you go to the movie theater, the other people that you're there with, or when you go out to a drama or a concert, the other people that show up, or the people that you go along with to do fun things, the people that you do things with in society. So what does that mean? The people that you do things with in society, that's really your personal networks. Who do you buy and sell from? Who do you go shopping with? Who do you see from day to day as you walk around the streets? So the 11th house represents that, the personal networks. Saturn doesn't. Saturn represents aloneness. But remember, Saturn is malefic, and malefics tend to make good outcomes in the 11th house. So the question here still is like, how is this dynamic playing out? The aloneness of Saturn, the networkiness of the 11th house. So the variation is going to be the practicality of your personal networks. That's where it comes to Saturn, really. Saturn doesn't care too much about whether or not it feels nice to say hi, whether or not it's good manners to open the door for somebody. Saturn cares about practical issues. If I open the door for this person, do things happen more effectively? Do things get better? If I say hi, does that serve some purpose? That's what Saturn cares about. So putting Saturn in the 11th, it asks us, how practical are we in our personal networking? If it is very positive, in the 11th house, then it describes you as being very well connected. But if it's negative in the 11th house, then it describes you as being locked in. Well connected means you have very good practical connections with people in society. So you know people that can get things done. You have powerful contacts. You have influential associates. A lot of people know you and think that you're useful, and you know a lot of useful people. So when you need to get something done in the world, you know who to call, you know who to ask, etc. That's the positive Saturn in the 11th on this theme. The negative Saturn, I described as locked in. So what I mean is you're kind of boxed in. Your network size is constrained, but it's still strong. So you don't have that many people that you know who can get things done. You don't have that many people who can pull strings for you, etc. And not that many people know you as somebody who's useful. But the few people that you do have last for a long time and are trustworthy. So that is the second theme of Saturn in the 11th house. The third theme was how it will affect your income. The 11th is the house of profit, right? It's what you're getting from society. So things like your salary or your sales. Saturn is the planet of thrift. Saturn only wants things that are really essential. So if Saturn is in the 11th house, the thrifty planet in the profit house, we are really examining your income to expense ratio. How much profit are you getting versus how thrifty are you with your expenses? So if Saturn's positive here, then you're very profitable. You have a great profit to expense ratio. But if Saturn is negative, you're just getting by. What do I mean by profitable? Well, obviously, right? But let me just explain it anyway. Your income exceeds your expenses. So it doesn't mean necessarily that you make trillions and trillions of dollars. Positive Saturn in the 11th house just means that you have more money than you need. Whether that's $10 or whether that's $10,000, it's a lot more than you need. So since you're getting more than you need, and since we're talking about the thrifty planet, you have the ability to save. So you're not spending things compulsively or wildly on luxuries that are unimportant. Therefore, even if you only need $8, but you make $10, well, in that week you save 2. So the next week you got 12 instead of 10, and the next week you get 14, like that. So eventually what happens with Saturn in the 11th house positive is that you wind up with a lot of savings. Then you can convert that surplus into assets, real practical things that actually bring you happiness or at least significant practical use. A car, a house, like real things, practical things, not just lollipops or nights on the town. Saturn in the 11th house in the negative state, it's not so bad. It means you're getting by. Your profit to expense ratio is about equal. So it doesn't mean that you don't make that much money necessarily. It just means however much money you're making, somehow it's all going away. You make $10, you spend $10. You make $10,000, you spend $10,000. So you don't wind up with a surplus that you can save and then convert into major assets. But you also don't necessarily, just from Saturn in the 11th alone, have financial danger. Now, if you're wondering if this applies to you, well, obviously, you're probably already here because you have Saturn in the 11th house, but there's a lot of other ways that this would work. So, for example, if it's in the 11th sign from your moon, or if it's in your 11th sign, the 11th sign from your ascendant, in any of its subdivisions, or if it's in the 11th sign from the ascendant in any of those subdivisions. In all those cases, you actually get Saturn in the 11th house. Also, aspects. So Saturn in a position that directly aspects the 11th house. And also Saturn transiting points that are in your 11th house. Will be times in your life when these topics are really coming to the fore. So let me show you some examples of known people who have Saturn in the 11th to put faces on these concepts that we've talked about. Remember we said Saturn in the 11th had these 3 themes: social impact, personal networks, and income. So social impact, we said, had these two polarities, the positive being mass appeal and effect, and the negative being an underground or an underdog or a failed leader. For examples of people with positive Saturn in the 11th, Leonardo da Vinci, Vincent van Gogh, Malcolm X, Prabhupada, Marie Curie, and Hans Gadamer. And for people with negative Saturn in the 11th, we have Hitler and Himmler, the Nazis. So this really now finally puts a face on what I meant by you might have a huge social impact, but it might be associated with a minority group or a failed group. In each one of these sets, let's look at least one of the charts so you can see what I mean by positive. Why is it positive in the 11th house? So Da Vinci, for example, here's this chart. His Saturn is in the 11th house in Libra, so it's exalted. And even beyond that, his Venus is in Taurus, so it's domicile. So there's tons of positive dignity there for Saturn in the 11th house. For the second theme, we said Saturn in the 11th house has to do with personal networks. Positively speaking, you're very well connected. Negatively speaking, you're locked into kind of a small group of contacts. So let's put some faces on this. Well connected, Caitlyn Jenner and Caitlyn Jenner's daughter, Kim Kardashian. Well connected, socially influential. Jack Black also. Positive Saturns in the 11th. Now, for locked in, putting some faces on this would be very helpful too. Phil Spector, the big music producer from the 60s and 70s, but also a criminal and a pedophile or sexual criminal. So he's well connected, but he's not very well known. He's not very well liked for all his connections. That was one version of the negative personal networking of Saturn in the 11th. The other great example is Ian Stewart. Who's Ian Stewart, you probably want to know. Well, guess what? Ian Stewart is one of the people that made the band, the Rolling Stones, but you don't even know his name. That also actually illustrates the social impact issue in a negative way, where you are the one that's influencing society, but people don't really know it. So let's take a look at his chart and see why he's got such strong negative versions of all these interpretations that we talked about. Look at the sign that his Saturn is in the 11th. It's in Aries. And then where is the Lord of Aries? Mars. It's in Cancer. So it's both of them are debilitated. Saturn in the 11th is debilitated, and Saturn's Lord is debilitated. So there's tons of negativity for his Saturn in the 11th. So Ian Stewart and Leonardo da Vinci are like opposite charts pertaining to Saturn in the 11th. Finally, let's look at the third theme, how Saturn in the 11th affects your income. If it's positive in the 11th, you're very profitable. If it's negative in the 11th, you're just getting by. Well, as for the profitable examples, we have Gigi Hadid, super wealthy. Kim Kardashian, even more super wealthy. Lionel Messi, also very wealthy, not as wealthy as them though, but still extremely profitable, making a lot more money than they could almost possibly spend. If you look at all of them, they kind of have an intelligence to them also about how they use the money that they made. Now, how about a negative example of Saturn's impact on income in the 11th house? Well, how about Lucky Luciano? Who's Lucky Luciano? Very famous mobster. So making tons of money, but also losing it all. And that's really illustrates what I was talking about. Why does Lucky Luciano fit the bill of the negative Saturn in the 11th? Well, because his Saturn is extremely combust in the 11th house. And it's with both the 6th and the 8th lords. So you can see how the interpretation of Saturn in the 11th really relies on how positive or negative Saturn is in the 11th house in your particular chart. I will include a special section at the end of this video to give you some hints and tips about how to figure out the positivity or negativity of a planet in a house or in a sign. Also, that's probably one of the best reasons why you would get one of my reports or one of my readings, because all those calculations are already completely done for you and it's just handed to you. So now let me show you how my reports figure out whether or not your Saturn in the 11th house is positive or negative, or how much it's positive, how much it's negative. So as you see, the interpretation of any planet in any house really depends an awful lot on the positivity or negativity of that planet. So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the first house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the first house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall and Saturn in Libra is exalted. And there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic, or the sun or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10. And the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If a planet is the lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the first, because the lord of the first wants to protect the whole chart, because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the 5th or the 9th. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the 4th or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing, or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry, you can do that. You can go to my website, victicara.com, click into the report section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart, or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. Also, just this is how I describe Saturn in the 12th house in my readings. And of course, in those readings, I tailor this to reflect how positive or negative your particular Saturn is. In this video, I'll explain these statements and also the logic behind the statements. It's best to think of Saturn in the 12th house as affecting 3 main areas of your life. So those would be your sense of dignity, your practicality, and your financial tact. So what you want to do is take each of those 3 themes and envision a positive and a negative effect from each. So let's take a look at them now one by one, and I'll show you examples of people who have Saturn in the 12th house that illustrate these things. So first of all, the topic of dignity. Your dignity, not the planet's dignity. Saturn in the 12th house affects your dignity. When I explain the logic why, then it'll be more clear what I mean by this word dignity. So the reason is that the 12th house has to do with giving up. Because of where it is in the sky, it's right above the eastern horizon. So it's weathering what the eastern horizon of the first house symbolizes. So it's making you tired, because the first house is the self, and it's making you want to stop and sleep and give up. So the 12th house represents giving up. But Saturn is the exact opposite. It represents not giving up. So when you have Saturn in the 12th house, it's painting a picture about how much do you stick to your principles and yourself, even when you want to stop, even when it's not convenient, even when you want to give up. Now, if we envision a positive and a negative ramification of this, the positive one could be expressed as integrity, and the negative ramification could be expressed as shamelessness. So let me explain each one. By integrity, I mean that you have firm control of yourself. You have self-restraint. When you feel like giving up, you don't give up. When you feel like letting go, you don't let go. You keep true to your responsibilities, your duties, your principles, etc. That is what a strong Saturn in the 12th house shows us. You have great integrity. You stick by your convictions. Now, to explore the negative ramification of Saturn's effect on dignity when it's in the 12th house, it's shamelessness. So shamelessness means a complete lack of self-restraint. In fact, you don't even want to stop yourself. You don't even see how it would be intelligent to stop yourself from doing something that's more convenient or more expedient. Even though it violates principles, even though it violates what you stand for or whatever. You don't mind changing what you stand for, flipping your principles around to be convenient to the things that you want to accomplish. You'll recourse to any deed to accomplish whatever it is that you want to accomplish. You don't have shame to say, no, I shouldn't do that, or that's beneath me. Now, how about some examples to illustrate this polarity of dignity between shamelessness and integrity? Well, guess what, people? There's going to be a lot of new subscribers and a lot of new unsubscribers when I show you these examples, because the example for a dignified Saturn in the 12th house is Barack Obama, and the example of an undignified Saturn in the 12th house is Donald Trump. So you know I have my own opinions, my own politics, but that's not a part of what's going on here in this video. This is just the math. When you enter Barack Obama's birth data into my readings, my reports, and you enter Donald Trump's birth data into my reports, the facts just get spit out. And the facts are that Obama's Saturn in his 12th house is 100% dignified, whereas Donald Trump's is 36% dignified. And here are their charts. With Trump's chart in particular, it's interesting to see how his undignified Saturn in the 12th house is very intimately connected with financial planets. Both the Lord of the Second and the 11th are with it. Whereas for Barack Obama, his Saturn is all alone in his 12th house in great dignity. So in Trump's case, this shamelessness really plays out mostly. You see it mostly affect the expediency by which he wants to get money and wants to earn profit and wants to better himself and, better himself financially, better himself materially. Okay, now let's move on to the second theme for interpreting Saturn in the 12th house, and that is all about your practicality. This is an issue with Saturn in the 12th house because the 12th house represents fantasy. Again, it's the area of the sky that's above the eastern horizon. The eastern horizon is the first house. It's where things are tangible. It's where the sun rises, things become seen. But the 12th house above the eastern horizon is what weathers and erodes it. So the 12th house represents things that are erosive of tangibility, things that are not tangible. So the 12th house symbolizes fantasy or abstract ideas. But Saturn is quite the opposite. It is very, very tangible. It is very, very practical. It is very real and realistic. So because of this juxtaposition between the planet and the house it occupies, it becomes an important theme to interpret. The issue here is going to be how well do you bridge the gap, the divide between the tangible and the idealized, between the fantasy and the reality. Now remember, we should give this a positive and a negative permutation. For the positive permutation, let's express that as inventiveness. You're really good at bridging the gap between an abstract idea and a tangible reality. The negative ramification is just simply expressed as irrationality. So let's explore both of those concepts in a little bit more detail. Positive Saturn in the 12th house indicates a person who thinks practically. Thinking, by the way, is part of the abstract world, right? So if you think practically, that means you're able to take thoughts and apply them very well to real situations. So here you'll find people who are able to express thought and emotion in sensorial ways. You'll find people who are able to solve practical problems using intelligence. One phrase that I like for this is that a person with a positive Saturn in the 12th house has novel, practical solutions. On the negative side, we said negative Saturn in the 12th house is irrationality. So what I mean by that is your thought processes are impatient, not really very thorough. You reason things through, you try to connect facts to ideas and so forth a little bit only, because you don't really have the patience, the tenacity to work out the details of how this abstract ideal relates to something real. Because there's too many steps involved, intellectual steps involved, linking those two things, bridging the gap between the ideal and the real. So people with negative Saturn in the 12th house, their thoughts seem a bit dislocated. The way that they think, the way that they reason is difficult to follow unless you're a similar person. Their motivations and their reasonings for the things they feel and do are kind of mysterious or unclear. The solutions that these people try to apply to practical things, therefore, tend to be ineffective. And also the way that they express themselves tends to get them more alienated or more into difficulty. Again, Trump would be a good example of this negative Saturn in many ways. Perhaps Barack Obama would also be a good example of positive Saturn in the 12th house in this case as well. But I have somebody else very interesting. In fact, quite a lot of people that I want to mention. Frank Herbert, the author of Dune, is an excellent example illustrating exactly what I mean about this positive sense of Saturn in the 12th house, giving you the ability to bridge between fantasy and reality, to create a link between an abstract idea or a fantasy or a dream and something other people can actually experience with their real senses. Herbert's Saturn in the 12th house, as calculated by my readings, is 96% positive, which is pretty phenomenal. The very interesting thing about it, though, is that it's in Virgo, which, as you know, is very mercurial, and so is very akin to his particular type of positive Saturn in the 12th house, which is related with words, and very complex words and very detailed interactions between characters and locations and plots. Also, you might notice as with the third lord, which helps it become a writer. And it's also with the 10th lord. The 10th lord and the third lord, so writing as a profession. So there are many, many, many artists, actors, and actresses who have a positive Saturn in the 12th house. To name a few, we have Franz Schubert, Chaka Khan, Audrey Hepburn, and Whitney Houston. For a new example of a negative Saturn in the 12th house, especially as it pertains to this irrationality, I could bring up Lyle Mendez, who is the guy who killed his parents along with his brother because his father removed him from the will. His father was a multimillionaire. You could see just like an irrational thought process where a cause doesn't really link to the effect, except only in his mind it's justified. It makes sense to him, but not to many other people, what he did. So my reports calculate his Saturn to be 21% dignified, which is quite low. And you can see here in this chart that it's not just undignified in the 12th house, but it's with Rahu, which is really making it wild. Now, as for the third key thing about Saturn in the 12th house, that's the financial tact. I don't mean tactful, but I mean tacticalness. How tactical are you with your finances? The reason here is that the 12th house represents expenses. Again, it's above the eastern horizon. So it symbolizes what's being taken away from you, expenses. Saturn, on the other hand, symbolizes thrift. So when you put this planet of thrift into the house of expense, what it's really telling us is what your spending habits are. If you have a positive Saturn in the 12th house, then you have great tacticality in how you spend your money. You're patient with money. You don't rush financial things. You let money sit for a bit so you can accumulate it. You don't need to spend it. You spend it on things that are smart. You spend it on things that you actually benefit from and that will actually make you more money. But if you have negative Saturn in the 12th house, this financial ramification is that you're kind of financially impatient. You can't wait for money, so you do these very risky things. You have very erratic spending patterns and behaviors too, where it seems like you're not really a very expensive person, then all of a sudden you spend something on stuff that seems pretty irrelevant and irrational. So, for examples for this one, we could again just look at Trump and Obama. Because Obama is a person who's very, very, very wealthy without being very flashy about how he's gone about his finances. Just tactical about it. You can also look at George W. Bush as an example of a very, very wealthy person with positive Saturn in the 12th house. Donald Trump, however, although he's very wealthy just because of the sheer amount of money that he inherited to work with, he's very unwise and impractical and rash with what he does with his money.
So as you see, the interpretation of any planet in any house really depends an awful lot on the positivity or negativity of that planet. So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the first house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the first house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall and Saturn in Libra is exalted. And there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic or the sun or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10. And the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If a planet is the lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the first, because the lord of the first wants to protect the whole chart because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the 5th or the 9th. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the 4th or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing, or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry. You can do that. You can go to my website, victorcara.com, click into the report section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart, or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. Also, just you doing that helps YouTube spot this video and show it to other people. So I would really appreciate that.